Recession is looking more and more likely for many of the world's leading economies. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. They recently released a feeble and uneven global growth output expectation for this year. Now, Australia is no exception. Our disastrous COVID recovery has left us in a $50 billion budget deficit. Not to mention we've got rocketing mortgage and rental payments, growing financial instability and a huge national debt. But apparently, Treasurer Jim Chalmers thinks we'll be okay. Maybe not great, but okay. Is he being a bit too naively optimistic? Well, joining me now is our business editor, Ross Greenwood. Ross, the Treasurer points to our low unemployment and really good export prices, and he says there are advantages for Australia in this fragile global market. But do you think it's going to be enough to avoid a recession?
I think here probably it will be, and so long as those employment numbers hang on, remember that the government collects around half of its tax revenue each year from effectively PAYG taxpayers, and the reality is also that if those people are now getting pay rises as a result of inflation, many of them are being nudged up into a higher tax bracket through bracket creep, and so, you know, the government is actually getting more money through the door. Just to give you a small example, Jim Chalmers handed down his first budget in October last year. Well, the accounts came out from the Department of Finance last Friday a week ago, which showed that the budget is improved by $20 billion since that time. So there's an extra $20 billion that the government's got that it didn't have then. The thing that really concerns me in some ways is that Jim Chalmers, perhaps the softening is up for some bigger tax reform or tax change, because as he says, things are going to get tougher. And Australia will slow down, there's no doubt about that. You can actually see this from some of the numbers from the International Monetary Fund, and it's also a 2 or 3 speed world at the moment. So if you just have a look at some of the numbers that came out from last night, the first thing you'll note is really that the developed world, and that is, you know, the US, Europe and also the UK, they show a much softer outlook, really, than many of the developing economies. So the developing economies are going to do well. So this is India and China, Vietnam, Malaysia, these types of economies are going to do much, much better. But then you go on and you actually come back to Australia and look at where the International Monetary Fund is. Now, there should be no surprise with these forecasts. So I'm just putting alongside the International Monetary Fund on the left-hand column, the Reserve Bank's forecast on the right-hand column. And what you can see here is, in fact, the Reserve Bank in 2024 is more pessimistic than the International Monetary Fund. So Jim Chalmers keeps talking, and he's now gone off to the International Monetary Fund and the basically leaders of the Western world, the finance ministers, to talk about this. And then he sets the budget when he comes back. That's going to be the interesting side of it, because he continues to talk about the debt and the tough times. But of course, many of these spending initiatives are really Labor Party principles that they want to adhere to into the future that ultimately are going to cost money, and that money's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, it certainly does. And Ross, I guess part of it is that Australia finds itself in an area of the world or a region where there are high growth countries, as you mentioned, Vietnam, China, India, and so forth. How can we future-proof our own nation to take advantage of that going forward? What does the government need to do?
Well, the one thing the government is doing right now is rapidly increasing Australian population. Now, the problem of that is it comes with all the pressures. You can see it in rents. So capital city rents in the past year are up by almost 25%. I noticed in Sydney today, the latest report says if you're renting an average house in Sydney right now, it's going to cost you $50,000 a year. So just think, you get your mind around that one for starters. And other capital cities, somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000. So, you know, this is a large amount of money. So rents are rising, adding to inflation. But by adding more population, especially when there are jobs, what happens is that, A, you're filling those jobs, you're filling the taxpayer base. And so long as the employment stays strong for Australia, then hopefully our economy does slow, but it actually avoids a recession. But the real problem is if interest rates or inflation keeps on rising and unemployment starts to rise, the hurt in our Australian economy becomes really the replica of what you're seeing in the United States, Europe and the UK right now. And this is really, if you like, the reason why the Reserve Bank, there's so much pressure on it to get these settings right. And right now they're trying to glide Australia's economy into a soft landing. And of course, there are real, you know, threats and real risks in doing that, that simply they get their settings wrong. And as a result of that, have to ultimately put interest rates up more aggressively in the future.
Well, let's hope they don't have to do that. One thing I think the Treasurer has done pretty well is reject Victorian Premier Dan Andrews' plea for more money, because Andrews, as we know, blew the Victorian budget. He's got wild spending, he's closing down local businesses, lockdowns in the pandemic. And now they've got another $100 billion blowout on a rail loop down there. It's going to add $20,000 to every Victorian's state debt. How can they avoid a soft landing in Victoria? It's a very important state economically to us.
I don't think they can. I think that's the real issue. And ask anybody who's got a holiday house or an investment property in Victoria right now what their land tax has done over the past 12 months, and you'll hear horror story after horror story. People who have had, many multi-times increases in the land tax, and this is simply the government trying to recoup some of that money. Of course, it's not the position of federal governments to have to bail out, sort of state governments that have got their settings wrong. That's just not the way in which it should work. Because ultimately those governments have got to be responsible for their own settings, and they've got to face their own voters. I think that's the reality of it. Now, in the case of Victoria, it's a manufacturing hub and a heart. It's important for Australia, not only from a population point of view, but also really from the value add that it can create for Australia's economy. And that's the reason why right now Victoria quite clearly has got to sort out its mess itself.
It certainly does. Thanks so much for your insights tonight, Ross Greenwood. Always appreciate it. And you can catch more of Ross on Business Now. That's 4:30, Monday through Friday, right here on Sky News.